Cheka, Joint State Political Directorate, People's Commissariat for Internal Affairs, KGB, FSB. Different names, same essence. These are all names for the same secret service, which for more than 100 years has carried out the dirtiest and most vile orders of the Soviet and now Russian dictatorship. For more than a century it has regularly shed its skin like a viper, but its essence has remained the same. That's why they can all be called by one general term. Lubyanka inevitably remained not only the intelligence agency itself, but also the methods its employees used to achieve their goals: torture, intimidation, extrajudicial executions, and reprisals. That's the calling card of Lubyanka. There's no better way to put it. Today we'll talk about the main Soviet and Russian intelligence agency, why it was created, what its main purpose is, and the specifics of its operations. Of course, we'll also touch on its role in the repressions, look at the main methods of torture and interrogation used by KGB officers throughout the years, and most importantly, analyze the role and place of Lubyanka in modern Putin-era Russia. I'll be concise and objective. I'm Semyon from Mega Show Television. Let's begin. The nature of Soviet Special Services. Before we can understand the specifics of how the Soviet Special Services operated, we first need to remember what they were actually created for. So, a few weeks after overthrowing the legitimate provisional government, the gang of Bolsheviks led by Ulyanov Lenin began to realize that, in fact, they weren't exactly loved by the people. It's a paradox, but in reality, neither the workers nor the peasants really supported the workers' and peasants' government. This is evidenced by the results of the elections to the All-Russian Constituent Assembly, which were held at the end of November 1917. In those elections, the Bolsheviks received only 23.3% of the votes, not even a quarter. Historians still consider these elections the only honest, democratic, fair, and competitive ones in Russian history. So, over the next 100 years, Russia didn't really evolve much, except maybe for the worse. Well, anyway, let's get back to the topic at hand. Realizing that Soviet power essentially relied on bayonets and simple manipulation of impressionable minds, Lenin and his brothers decided to create an organization that would protect the regime they had established, using any means necessary. I want to emphasize absolutely any methods. That is, Lubyanka was originally created not to fight foreign spies, who are the natural enemies of any state, and not for intelligence activities, but first and foremost as a tool of political control and to protect the Soviet dictatorship from its own citizens. This unfortunate fact was even reflected in the very name itself. So, on December 20, 1917, the All-Russian Extraordinary Commission for Combating Counter-Revolution and Sabotage was created. But what is counter-revolution? In the understanding of the Bolsheviks, this meant any form of protest or opposition activity accordingly. And who are counter-revolutionaries? These were their own fellow citizens who had a point of view different from the official one and had the audacity to defend it, including by armed means. These facts fully determined the repressive nature of the Soviet Special Service even at the stage of its initial formation, and in this, by the way, lies its fundamental difference from the special services of Western countries. If the latter were mainly created to fight external enemies, then Lubyanka was primarily created to fight internal enemies, that is, its own people. For comparison, neither the CIA nor military intelligence, SIX nor Mossad have ever been given the functions of police control over their own citizens. Their activities are aimed exclusively at maintaining national security. And moreover, the overwhelming majority of Western intelligence agencies are under strict control not only by the government but also by the public, most often in the form of parliamentary oversight. For example, the CIA is accountable to both chambers of the United States Congress, namely the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence and the House Permanent Select Committee on Intelligence. The activities of military intelligence SIX are overseen by the Intelligence and Security Committee of the British Parliament, and Mossad reports to the Foreign Affairs and Defense Committee of the Knesset. Lubyanka, on the other hand, has never reported to anyone except the top leadership of the party nomenclatura to the Politburo. It's no coincidence that the KGB's motto was loyalty to the party, loyalty to the motherland. This fact naturally gave rise to a sense of complete impunity and permissiveness. That's why the security services, both in Soviet times and under Putin, have always operated and continue to operate as a state within a state, living exclusively by their own laws and codes, which often differ little from criminal ones, with confession being the queen of evidence. So, we've established that Lubyanka primarily performed police functions but with a certain political undertone. Naturally, the question arises, how did they carry out these functions? Or perhaps more accurately, what was the main goal of the Chekists' investigative work? The chief Soviet prosecutor Andrei Vyshinsky, often called Stalin's Red Inquisitor, described this goal as concisely and clearly as possible. After all, it was he, more than anyone else, who laid the groundwork for the legal justification of those terrible repressions of the 1930s, and he himself acted as the state prosecutor at the show trials against the former associates of the leader of the people. By the way, these were some of the few political trials where foreign journalists were invited, so that the whole world could see for themselves that law and justice in the first socialist state were, of course, perfectly fine. How could it be otherwise? And this goal was stated as the recognition of the queen of evidence. That is, essentially, the work of all the investigative departments at Lubyanka was aimed at obtaining sincere confessions of guilt, and ideally, even public repentance for all their sins before the Soviet motherland. And really, why waste your precious time searching for some material evidence, questioning witnesses, confrontations, and so on? Let bourgeois investigators bother with that. But in a country of universal equality and happiness, a personally signed confession is more than enough. Especially since the scheme is both universal and effective. One person testifies against three, who are then arrested and interrogated, each giving testimony against three more, continuing the cycle. In geometric progression, you can quickly uncover an entire counter-revolutionary conspiracy. And if you try harder and longer, you can even fabricate an entire anti-Soviet organization. After all, just one broken prisoner is unlikely to surprise anyone much. That's routine for any KGB officer, but if you uncover a conspiracy, you might get a star on your shoulder boards and a promotion. If you're lucky, you might receive the Order of the Red Banner, and top investigators could get the Order of Lenin with its privileges. And that's the reality. That's exactly how Lubyanka has always operated and still operates. Foolproof methods of operation. But how do you get that sincere confession if the detainee isn't cracking properly? You need to use special methods to loosen the tongue of a silent client. I won't even mention the usual beatings with hands, feet, or improvised objects. Those are just the tip of the iceberg. After all, the Lubyanka had its own brutal interrogation methods that even medieval inquisitors would envy. But let's start with the lighter versions, the ones that are bloodless and, in their own way, painless. Primarily, psychological pressure and manipulation of detainees, especially constant threats to harm their loved ones, mainly wives and children. Despite this, dear Iosif Vissarionovich publicly stated that a son is not responsible for his father's actions. This included fake executions, where people like Vlast were blindfolded, taken out and shot with blanks, used on him at least twice. The room was under surveillance for a day, you see. Planting informers in the cell was done not just to get information. Even the neighbor was surprised, and the assignment and the interpreter managed to get the message across. The method involved non-stop interrogation for 3 to 5 days, sometimes weeks, without sleep. Investigators taking turns would drive the arrested person to a state of complete physical and mental exhaustion, when he was ready to sign anything just to get a chance to simply rest. The next most brutal method was the standing torture, meaning prolonged forcing to stand in one position, often for many hours or even days, without the ability to sit or lean against anything. Sometimes this was supplemented by the death box, meaning being placed in a cramped, overcrowded cell with high temperatures and a lack of air. This last method was especially effective during the summer heat. The next level of torture involved inflicting burns of any kind, thermal, chemical, and especially electrical. The KGB officers were especially fond of practicing electrotherapy. It was simple. They'd plug it in, then apply the 2 exposed wires to any body part, usually the genitals. After a couple of shocks like that, you'd sign anything in the protocol. Well, for variety, they used an iron and other heated metal objects, pouring acid or other chemicals on limbs, especially sophisticated methods. For true connoisseurs of sadism, there was the swallow, when a person was hung from the ceiling by their hands tied behind their back, torture on the rack or stretching joints with straps and ropes, and also solitary confinement with icy water up to the ankles. There are too many to name. The key point is that after days of torture, the arrested person would sign the interrogation protocol without reading it, simply to end the torture. And of course, such protocols became irrefutable evidence of guilt. All the special methods I mentioned, and those I didn't, were combined with others. For example, the arrested were presented with ready-made, fabricated testimonies of other accomplices, which were actually either written by the investigators themselves or also obtained under torture. This gave the impression the case was solved and further resistance was pointless. In some cases, when the accused faced an open court trial, investigators and assistants ensured no visible marks were left on the body. If needed, they called doctors and gave some treatment in the prison hospital. Free Soviet healthcare even treated enemies of the people, so it would be easier for an assistant to execute them after sentencing. The world's most humane court. In all civilized countries of the world, there is an institution that is supposed to filter out such fabricated cases, acting as a kind of filter that prevents an innocent person from suffering from police arbitrariness. And that institution is the court, specifically the court, and no one else. It was supposed to examine the case prepared by Prosecutor Derla from a critical point of view, relying on real evidence and, of course, taking into account the position of the accused and his lawyer. This is known as the parties' evidentiary process. When prosecution and defense had equal opportunities and the court remained neutral, objectively weighing all pros and cons. But all these legal intricacies are really just for the bourgeois. The Soviet court is different, honest and fair, and of course it would never convict an innocent person. At the start of Bolshevik rule, instead of the people's courts Vladimir Lenin promised, revolutionary tribunals were set up. They judged not by law, which didn't yet exist, but by revolutionary expediency and political instinct. That's harsh. And I'm not even mentioning the fact that the members of these tribunals often had not just no legal education, but no other education at all except for 3 years of parish school. In the 1920s, the situation improved as trials began following the law and new criminal and procedural codes were introduced. Yes, the judges learned a little something somehow, but they understood one simple truth. Do you want to live in comfort, get special rations, a personal apartment, and a company car? Right, serve the party and personally Comrade Stalin, and above all, never contradict all those Lubyanka people. Joint State Political Directorate, People's Commissariat for Internal Affairs, and later Ministry of State Security. And what did that mean, Kakchem? Exactly, the prosecutor gets unquestioned approval. If they demand a firing squad, it happens. If they want 25 years in camps or 10 years without correspondence, that's what occurs. So we'll write up whatever verdict the valiant Chekists need, that's what we'll write. But the Lubyanka made sure to cover themselves here too, in case there was some stubborn or overly principled judge. They did something unheard of in any law-abiding country. They created extrajudicial bodies, meaning ones that aren't mentioned in any legal act about the judicial system, but at the same time gave these bodies judicial powers. This innovation was called the Special Council under the People's Commissariat for Internal Affairs of the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. There was no need for any prosecutors or lawyers here, let alone appeals or even requests for pardon. All these little details of life were of no interest to the competent authorities. It was straightforward. They would simply bring you into a separate office, and a couple of Chekist commissars would read out a sentence that had already been written in advance. But even that wasn't enough. During the years of the Great Terror, in the infamous year of 1937, Lubyanka obtained the authority to sentence people to death on its own, even without any kind of pseudo-judicial procedure. That's how the bloody People's Commissariat for Internal Affairs troikas appeared, stamping out death sentences by the hundreds of thousands, and the result was not long in coming. Between 1937 and 1938, over 1.5 million people were arrested for anti-Soviet activity, with nearly 700,000 executed on average. About 1,000 people were shot daily across the Union. Only the German concentration camps Auschwitz and Buchenwald could rival such efficiency. Subtitles: Stalin is dead, but his legacy lives on. Subtitles. Some of the more advanced viewers might write this in the comments. After Stalin, life improved. And indeed, the death of the bloody tyrant significantly slowed down the flow of repressions. The stream of terror didn't stop completely, but all extrajudicial forms of punishment were abolished. But political repressions themselves didn't go anywhere. They just became more localized, more targeted, and were also wrapped in a shell of formal legality and the rule of law. Accordingly, Lubyanka also somewhat disguised its activities. It was no longer considered proper to arrive at night in black vans and take people away to a bright communist future. That's why the KGB began to focus mainly on expanding its network of informants, that is, snitches, and on so-called prevention, meaning warning conversations with dissidents, threats, and pressure at work in order to prevent the formation of organized opposition. The most active ones were labeled as dissidents and imprisoned under the article for anti-Soviet agitation and propaganda. Punitive psychiatry was also especially popular. I already have a video on KGB psychiatric hospitals on my channel. Check it out. You'll learn how people's minds were broken, whose only crime was doubting the correctness of the official ideology and the policies of the ruling regime. And for Lubyanka, all these special hospitals made their work much easier. After all, it's much easier to declare the accused insane than to look for any evidence against them. Overall, after Stalin's death, Lubyanka's repressive methods became less bloody but more sophisticated and covert, shifting from mass terror to mind control and the individual suppression of dissent. And what's going on there today? Now, regarding current affairs, I don't think I need to explain what it means when a former state security lieutenant colonel leads the power structure. Lubyanka received extraordinary powers and once again became a state within a state, just like in Soviet times. The decade of Yeltsin's pseudo-democracy can be safely crossed out. It didn't change anything at all. The Federal Security Service's methods are essentially similar to the KGB's. The only real difference is that today the emphasis is on digital control over Russian society. Unlike the KGB, which mainly relied on informant reports, physical surveillance, and wiretapping phone conversations, the Federal Security Service since the early 2000s has acquired tools for total and automated control of digital communications. This refers not only to phone calls and short message service, but also to internet traffic along with the increasingly popular messengers. The pinnacle of this digital dictatorship is the Messenger Max, developed some time ago, whose name is almost openly interpreted as cop in your phone. Moreover, starting from September 1, 2025, installing this mobile application will be mandatory for pre-installation on all gadgets sold in Russia. So, the Federal Security Service is already very close to establishing the same kind of total control over every citizen that was described in Orwell's novel 1984. Another difference between the Russian and Soviet Lubyanka is the security service hierarchy's merger with government and big business. During Yezhov, Beria, and Andropov's eras, special services were all powerful but remained separate entities. But nowadays, Chekists, both former and active, get various positions not only within the security apparatus but also in the civilian sector. For example, Sergei Chemezov, a former neighbor and colleague of Putin in the German Democratic Republic, has led the major state monopoly Rostec Corporation for nearly 20 years. And another of Putin's buddies, KGB Colonel Viktor Ivanov, headed Aeroflot for a long time, and later the military concern Almazante. And moreover, the very fact of serving in the KGB or Federal Security Service significantly increases the chances of landing a lucrative position as a governor, a top manager of some enterprise, or even as a minister. In addition, the Federal Security Service acts as the main arbiter and protector of big business, since it has an unofficial but very real right to interfere in any sector of the economy under the pretext of security. For this protection, the generals get generous bonuses, suitcases of cash in the capital or a villa near Lake Como. Since Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine began, the Federal Security Service has greatly intensified its repressive measures. The methods used by the Federal Security Service have become much harsher, more comprehensive, and aimed at suppressing any internal dissent, as well as terrorizing and filtering people in the occupied territories. Persecution has expanded from targeting political positions to anyone who expresses an anti-war stance or simply criticizes the authorities. As you know, in 2016, that year, new laws like discrediting the armed forces of the Russian Federation and spreading fake news about the armed forces of the Russian Federation were enacted and are now widely used for rapid criminal prosecution. There was a tightening of digital surveillance as the number of cases initiated for posts, comments, and reposts on social networks increased. But the Federal Security Service is most active precisely in the occupied territories. There, the security officers have complete freedom. There are no restrictions in the form of lousy prosecutors and corrupt judges, meaning complete freedom of action. Filtration measures in general have clearly defined Stalinist roots and are therefore accompanied by mass violence both against prisoners of war and against the most active part of the Ukrainian population that found itself under occupation. Terror victims included not just anti-terrorist operation veterans, journalists, public figures, and activists, but also ordinary citizens. Just showing dissatisfaction with the occupier's authority is enough. That's why, in the early months of the war, pre-trial detention centers in Simferopol, Donetsk, and Rostov-on-Don were severely overcrowded. Reliable information is still lacking about many prisoners, including Kherson's legitimately elected mayor Ihor Kolykhayev, who refused to cooperate with the occupiers. And those who survived these dungeons and escaped to freedom. They discussed torture and abuse, which are largely similar to the methods used by the Valiant People's Commissariat for Internal Affairs. In general, to sum up, the torture methods of Lubyanka, whether in Soviet times or under Putin, remain the same. They are not the sadism of individual investigators, but a systematic, sanctioned, and unfortunately effective technology for fabricating legal grounds for political repression. It serves as an instrument of terror aimed at the complete destruction of the prisoner's personality, turning him from a citizen into an enemy of the people. And this will continue for as long as the security services exist in their current form. So, if some liberal comes to power in the Russian Federation, reforms should start with Lubyanka, otherwise everything will go back to the way it was. Thank you all for watching. Shame on everyone. My respect to those who support the channel during tough times, and I'll see you in the next video. Bye everyone.